Go for it.
All right. Welcome everybody to our first post-adoption training for the Unified Development Code. You may have heard from the presentation a moment ago. This is being recorded and will be made available through the community development website and Engage Bozeman, so folks can be able to continue to enjoy and learn from this process. So I am going to share a screen here and we'll get started. So we are starting off on this first one kind of at the basics. We realize there may be some new folks coming into the conversation. So this is focused on some introductory materials. We will have additional follow-ups that will dive into more detail on
Hey,
process
Chris.
and things like that.
Hey, Chris, your screen isn't being shared.
Oh, thank you. Let me figure out why. Okay, is it showing up now?
No, yes, it's thinking. And
Okay,
there it goes. There it goes.
all right, there we go. Gotta love the computers.
Yep.
Um, so this is the outline for the presentation we're going to do this afternoon. I'm going to be joined for the project docs section by Audrey Chorak, one of our development review coordinators, who helps folks in making applications. And we figured that would be a new element we haven't talked about before that folks may have some interest in. So we'll be touching on that in a minute. We will do questions and answers at the end. If you have a question coming up through the presentation, feel free to put it into the Q&A, and our communications folks will keep an eye on that, and then we'll address those at the end. So starting with on where to find a new code, for those who are familiar, the Engage Bozeman website is the city's go-to place for our public engagement projects for big work like this. We have posted the final draft and the zoning map as well. Both of those are up and will be available as we go forward. One thing I'm going to also show you here for a minute is also the city usually places its code through Unicode. Many folks are familiar with that. It's available through the city clerk link on the city's website. This has several different elements to it, where you can see the code of ordinances and what's changed, adopted ordinances not yet codified. It takes some time for our vendor to process these kinds of large ordinances and get them integrated into the rest of the municipal code. So there is a link to each of the ordinances as they post. The Unified Development Code will be added to that list. And so in addition to the location on Engage Bozeman, you will be able to get it here. For the meantime, as projects are continuing to run forward under the older code, that will continue to be available through the table of contents here in chapter 38. So a couple of different ways where folks can find the document. So for those who aren't aware, replacing the code is a fairly routine thing for the city of Bozeman. We started with zoning in 1935. We have now in 2025 adopted the latest iteration of that. Each of the bubbles that you see there is a code replacement. When we do these kinds of replacements, there's always a transition period. And in this case, the new code takes effect on February 1st of 2026. So that's a Sunday. And for applications that are in review prior to that date, there's a step called completeness, where the city determines that there is or is not all of the necessary information submitted with an application in order to perform the review that's required. If the application is complete in advance of the February 1st date, then that application continues forward with the regulations in effect on the day that it was determined to be complete. If it's an application that occurs afterwards, then the new regulations will apply. We ask folks to think carefully about this because we are going to be seeing applications going through the process, going out to public notice, and being constructed over the next year or two that are finishing off under the old rules. That's just how the system works. It's always done that with that transition period built in. So it's going to take a little time before we start seeing the physical outcomes from the new code. The Unified Development Code does cover a lot of different elements. Locations, the districts, utilities and parks, natural resources, all kinds of different things. And these are distributed throughout different pieces of the code. In order to help folks find things, we're going to go through each of the articles and touch on what those subjects are contained and help you to be able to figure out where in the code, if you have an interest, you might want to go look for the regulations relevant to that area of interest. So for each of the articles, we'll give you the title, a table of contents, and then the number of pages. And down below here, some color coding for whether things changed a little bit or a lot in that particular article. So general provisions is really kind of the highest level. It's laying out what's the authority that happens, where's the jurisdiction of the zoning. For example, Bozeman zoning only applies within the city limits. Other communities or at other times, the zoning has gone outside of the city limits, so making clear where those regulations apply. And this is the portion of the municipal code where it says you do have to follow all the rules in the chapter. So that's plainly stated in one location here. And the portions of Article 1 are going to be affecting all the rest of the articles that we're going to be talking about in a minute. Article 2 is the zoning districts. This has several different elements to it. First are the authorization to have zoning districts and a map, identifying each of the different types of zoning districts that are out there. Things like special districts are where you're going to find things like the neighborhood conservation overlay district. Planned developments are a new thing. Those went into the code in 2022. They replaced planned unit developments. And then a large portion of this is focused on the rules of interpretation. We'll talk about a little bit more detail here in a minute. So one thing I do want to call out is that as part of this, there's a description of each of the purposes for the different districts. Those purpose statements are not regulatory. They're simply information to help people understand what kind of a district it is. The regulations themselves are the balance of the regulations that are included in the district description, setbacks and heights, things like that. So the kinds of zoning districts that we have, they're grouped by different types in the code. We've merged several districts through this process. We've created the new B3C district for the downtown mixed-use core. That's the area kind of a half block north and south of Main Street from roughly Rouse to Grand, and helps protect the historic character there. Some districts were deleted with this code update. The residential office district, urban mixed use district, and residential manufactured housing districts all were deleted and replaced on the zoning map with one of the ones that you see on the screen. For each of these districts, there is a standardized layout, kind of a two-page structure where it defines the standards for lots and for the buildings. As you can see, there is a lot of information on these pages, and these are set up to be kind of the high-level cliff notes, if you will, for each individual district that identifies the standards that apply. There's a visual key here that helps you understand, all right, this is B. I can look down here and see that that's lot coverage, help you to visually connect the words and the graphics together. And then you can also see there's a series of blue bars. At least I hope it's blue on your screen. It's blue on mine. And in each of those is a section reference. And that is a link to what's called the rules of interpretation. For many of the standards that are identified in each of these zoning districts, there can be a lot of complexity. It can vary by zoning district or circumstance. And so rather than trying to pack every single thing into every individual district description and having to repeat that wording over and over again, that wording has been aggregated. So here outlined in the purple, we see a standard for streetscapes, and it references section 38-260-050, gives you some key basic information on the width of sidewalks and boulevard strips, things like that, tree spacing. And then if you follow down to that rule of interpretation language here, that's 38-260-050, it will give you further information that describes why we have that standard, what applicability it occurs with, and then further details on the standard itself. One element to watch for is that many of the standards have a section called relief. They don't all fall on number 5, but many do. And that identifies where there is some latitude that is built into the code. It's not a variance to do it or something like that. It's simply, these are the conditions under which there's going to be some flexibility in how we apply it. Sometimes that may have a specific numeric standard associated with it. Sometimes it may not, but it allows an opportunity. So for example, here relating to street trees requirements, city requires street trees. We think they're a really good thing, but we also recognize that sometimes the placement of an individual tree according to the usual spacing pattern may be a conflict with visual access to an intersection or other safety issue. And so there's some latitude for us in the review process to not require that individual tree or to relocate it elsewhere to protect the public safety. Land uses, this is where you see the actual standards for what happens where and the uses that apply to those in each individual district. As identified here, there are the allowed uses. That's a single summary table. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's general use standards. These are things that are applicable throughout the code and the city and are not limited to individual things. But then Division 38-320 talks about individual uses. So if you have a store, if you have an apartment building, are there things that are specifically unique to that particular use? You can find it under Division 38-320. And then there are also specific standards listed as shown for wireless facilities and then housing as well, affordable housing. So this is our use table. You can see that it includes all of the zoning districts across the top, and then the uses come down the side. That allows for there to be a quick comparison from one district to the other. If you see a particular letter or mark, you can come down to the bottom to the key. A P is a principal use. That means the assumption is if you follow the rules, the answer is going to be yes. There are accessory uses, which means it's not something that usually drives the predominant activity on a site, but it supports it. So it might be your garden shed in your backyard or something like that. A special use approval, that's a additional review, additional criteria that apply. There's some question about whether that should be approved or not. And then if there's a dash, it simply says you can't do that here in this particular district. And then you'll notice that both S's and P's sometimes have a little asterisk, and that tells you that there is some sort of use standard that is unique to that particular activity. And again, on the right-hand side in the column, you can see there's a whole series of reference numbers similar to the rules of interpretation for Article 2. about things like setbacks and building heights and things. This also lays out the unique elements that may apply for a specific use. So for example, if we look down under general residential uses, we see that for 3 and 4 unit dwellings, there is a different standard that might apply in the RA district than might apply somewhere else. So it gives you that additional set of details. So if you're considering, I'm interested in the use, I might want to pursue it, or I have a concern about it, you want to look at both the table as a starting point, again, kind of like the Cliff Notes summary for the individual districts, but then you also want to look down into the detail work that provides additional information. Article 4 is community design. So this is the level where we're kind of laying out the bones of future development. So things like streets and blocks and parks that have really long-term existence that allows placement for utilities and setting the context for future development. And the standards in Article 4 may be applied both with a subdivision or with a larger site plan. So this includes information about, for example, what's the spacing for streets, or how do I know how much parkland needs to be dedicated, or those kinds of significant questions. Article 5 is looking more at individual projects. So this is not dividing property. This is where we're going to start seeing things coming up out of the ground and going vertical with new buildings. These are not just functional requirements at the horizontal level, like spacing of parking or something like that, but also as they're going up, it also is affecting the visual character. So things like building design and landscaping, lighting, all those kinds of things are all included in Article 5. And there's typically these kinds of standards are going to be applicable to larger projects, things like site plans, although some of them, like parking, will also have application to smaller projects as well. Article 6, natural resource protection. The city recently adopted updated wetland and watercourse regulations earlier in 2025. Those did not modify with this code. They simply moved location and were aggregated into their own article. And then the city has had floodplain regulations for quite a few years. Those have been were updated about 3 years ago to meet federal requirements. And so those are all fairly current. The city adopted wetland and watercourse regulations back in about 2002. So we've had them for quite a while. Like I mentioned, they've recently been updated, and folks are welcome to review those. All of these regulations apply to any project where these kinds of resources are present. So if you have a wetland on your site, if you are adjacent to a water course, these standards are going to be influencing your particular design and site layout. Article 7, this is one of the longer sections, but it also covers a lot of important material. This is the process section, where it lays out who decides what kinds of things, what kinds of materials need to be submitted as part of an application, how we do noticing, the review process itself for subdivisions or site plans, how things like appeals or departures or variances get taken care of, text and map amendments, and then improvements in security. So how do we ensure that things get completed the way that they're supposed to when something gets approved? And then finally, non-conforming situations. Like I mentioned, we've had zoning since 1935. It's changed quite a few times. And certainly the city existed before 1935. So sometimes we do end up with a spot where there is a conflict between what is really on the ground and what the code would require. And so the non-conforming situations explains how we handle those situations. Generally, protection is for those non-conforming uses to continue as they are until somebody chooses to modify them or replace them. And then finally, we have Article 8, which is the definitions. Definitions section do not include specific standards themselves, but they do include a lot of important information, what constitutes this or that kind of a use, so that you can envision what they might be, how they might fit together. And an example would be recently, as part of the UDC update, the city created a definition for fraternity and sorority house. The standards that apply to that are in Chapter 38, Division 320 and Section 030, not in Article 8, but there are specific standards there. Some definitions come directly from the statute. We include them here for convenience of the reader so that you don't have to go chasing to the state law all the time. That's especially true for things like floodplains, where we are required to have certain definitions included directly in our code, even though the state has already defined them. Other elements that we have questions about pretty frequently, the city has its community development viewer. We are continuing to maintain this. It will continue forward after the new code kicks into place. And so we'll continue to be able to share information on projects that have come in and their status in the review, as well as other kinds of information. And I'm just going to show you quickly a little couple of helpful bits about using it. So if you're looking for that information, if you come to the city's website and go to departments and then straight down to GIS and mapping and community development, it will load up. Sometimes it takes a minute because it's pulling in a terrific amount of information. And you can see each of the colored areas is something where there's a project in some sort of status. If you click on one of the colored items, it will bring up a little information box. In this case, the one that I've clicked on, you can see here, there are multiple applications that have applied or been submitted for that particular piece of property. And so if you want to look at them, you can simply tab through them, and each of them will tell you the name of the project, the planning number, its status, other key information that you might want to use. One of the other elements that you also will be able to access is if you click on planning documents, it will take you to the city's Laserfiche archive, and each project that is on the map will have a set of information that is included here, including if there's a notice or a summary of the file, application drawings and documents, etc. So it's often the fastest way to find information. The documents and drawings and things don't get posted until it's ready for review, but that information does make it easier to find information. If you want to find out something, you look on an application and there's not data in there yet, you're welcome to stop at our office and we can have a conversation with you about what's been submitted and how to find out about it. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Audrey in our office, and she's going to talk about Project Docs, which is our data portal. So over to Audrey.
Thanks, Chris. Just pulling up my, can everybody see my screen okay? Okay. So as Chris mentioned, today I'm going to be talking to you guys about Project Docs and submitting a planning application. Before we dive into Project Docs, I wanted to highlight a couple of things on our website specifically. If you hover over departments and navigate over to planning, and scroll down to this planning checklist and guides option. This whole page is going to have a lot of great information that I'd encourage you to reference when you're ready to start submitting an application. Today, I'm just going to highlight this planning application and checklist library that has folders categorized alphabetically by application type. And it's a helpful tool when you're compiling your drawings and documents for application submission. We will have all these checklists updated come February. So if you already have documents saved on your computer, make sure that you're looking for this new header that we'll have that will kind of indicate that this is the updated checklist for the new UDC update. Of course, the checklist is a great place to start, but plan to reference some Unicode for a comprehensive list of items that you would need to include in your application submission. So once you have all of your documents and drawings ready, you're going to then navigate to Project Docs, which back to this planning checklist and guides page. The Project Docs portal link is available right at the top in yellow, and it will bring you to a login page. You can either log in if you've already been in Project Docs, or this will also give you the option to create an account. Just to give you a little bit more of an idea of what Project Docs is, in case you're unfamiliar, this is our online portal that tracks a variety of permits, planning, building, fire, engineering, business licenses, as you'll see, a lot of different options here. And it's a way to make electronic plan review more efficient. It saves costs on printed materials for our applicants. It's an easy way to be able to track the status of numerous applications with ease. And regardless of project size, this is where you're going to start, and it allows us to have accurate record retention. Before I move further, I will also just add that we're working on preparing an instructional video for the website that will dive into details at a much slower pace than what I'm going at. But for the purpose of today, I'm going to do a quick run through to cover high-level details. So you'll select here the planning application. And on this page, you're going to be able to see any of your projects that you've started. And then there's also the option to start a new application request. So under type, you'd select planning. And then if you have a project name that in mind, that's great. If you don't, we would just recommend using the address of your site. So once you press that start application process button, you'll sign a waiver, and then you'll come to a page here where you're really entering all the information about your site. And it's not until you get toward the end of this page that you actually indicate which application type you want to apply for. A lot of people get tripped up. They're looking at the previous page trying to figure out where to select site plan. This is where you'll select site plan. So you'll submit your request, and then it will go to our planning technicians who will formally do back-end work to put that information into our system. Our planning techs, Sam and Trent pictured here, work at our front desk. They're available for questions as you go through this process via phone, in person, or at planningtech@bozeman.net is always a great option. And once the application is processed, you'll be able to upload and submit those files based on the requirements for the project type. Again, starting at the checklist and using the code, and the planning techs will go ahead and start reviewing that. Once it's processed, you'll receive this task here. I want to just call out this task tab as a really important part of Project Docs. It's going to tell you whenever you have an action item to keep your projects moving forward. I will add that there is a due date for all the tasks that you'll see. It's just a recommended date. You can upload your documents and drawings at your leisure. We just won't be able to push the project through pre-screen to our department reviewers until all of those documents and drawings are uploaded. So once you do complete the upload and submit task, you'll see here that you'll submit it. Then you're officially in our pre-screen step of the process. This is the stage that determines if an application has sufficient information before we start having applicable departments review the information. It's also the step where we collect our application fees. If you need a little more info, if our Trenton or Sam, our planning techs need a little bit more information before pushing you through to the fee section, they will be leaving a comment. This review tab will pop up and you'll see a red unresolved task, and it will indicate that you need to do a little bit more digging or supply some more information. Once that's all taken care of, it will turn to green, and it will then allow you to move into that payment due task. I just want to call out that a lot of people get tripped up here because in order to pay the fee, you can either come in person or use our Click2Gov website, which is external from Project Docs, and you'll still need to complete the task here in order to notify our staff that you have paid the fee. So after the fee step, there is a files tab in the city documents and staff reports, a schedule letter. And in the schedule letter, you're going to see a planner who's assigned to your project, when you can anticipate reviews to be completed, and lastly, who your assigned development review coordinator is. And the development review coordinator, myself included, is a team of 3, and we are the main point of contact that gets assigned to you during the pre-screen process, and we'll be helping guide applicants through the rest of the application process. I would encourage you to reach out to us via phone or email for any project docs or project-related questions, and we're a great resource to help you get the answers that you need as quick as possible. And that's all for project docs today. I'm going to hand it back over to Chris.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. Appreciate that. Hope everybody has found that helpful. At this point, we're going to open up for questions and answers. So, Emily, what have we got so far?
Yeah, the first question is there a process for pausing the increased height allowance from 70 feet to 90 feet in B3 zones?
The City Commission has given final adoption of this, so the only way that they could change that is to restart a code process to amend the code. There's not a pause button on the law.
Next question. Can you clarify the difference between acceptability, completeness, adequacy, and approval in terms of the status of a current application and its need to apply to the new code?
Sure. The state has modified some of the terms that we're going to be using. So the current code that we've been under for a number of years used the terms of acceptability and adequacy. Those terms are going away. The new term in the statute is completeness. And completeness means that the applicant has provided to the city all the necessary information for us to do our review. Doesn't mean it's ready for approval. It doesn't mean that we have finished our review, but they have submitted the necessary information for us to do the review. So the folks who determine whether that is reached is the Development Review Committee. That's the collective staff who have responsibility for reviewing different areas. So the planners, engineers, parks department, etc. Each of them weighs in on their particular areas of responsibility. And if everybody says we have what we need, then that will determine that the application is complete, and we will document that as part of the review in project docs, like you just saw Audrey showing you some of those tasks and processes. So that's the step, that completeness stage, that which under the old code would have been considered adequacy. So same name or different names, same function, in order to lock in the regulations that apply.
Next question. This is a little longer, so let me know if you need me to repeat anything. This might be getting into the weeds, but are the streetscape standards updating the standard street sections? How do they interact with right-of-way widths? For example, on a 35-foot street in a 60-foot right-of-way, does the increased boulevard/sidewalk area shift property lines to the back of sidewalk rather than 1 foot behind it?
Okay, interesting question. Um, the standard street sections are what they are. Those are set by the engineering standards from our engineering division. The right-of-way width, likewise. So the right-of-way width is how big from left to right, so to speak, is the public area. And then the section says what happens inside of that area. For Bozeman, that includes sidewalks and curbs as well as the driving surface. So it would not shift the property line to the back of sidewalk rather than 1 foot. If we have a question where something appears like it's not fitting, then we will work with our engineering division during the review process to be able to resolve that situation. So it may vary a little bit depending on existing conditions. If you are in an area that has previously developed, we think it should fit for any new development.
Next question. On the non-conforming uses section, item D, is a vacancy of 90 days considered discontinued use?
That is a great question, and I'm going to go look really quickly. So just hold on a minute. The answer to that is yes. The longer answer to that is what constitutes being discontinued. So let's say that somebody had an office, which was a non-conforming office, wasn't allowed in that particular district, and the current tenant moves out. If it sits without any effort to lease it or otherwise continue the use, then yes, after 90 days, that's going to be considered to be discontinued. If it's actively being marketed for lease, then the intention expressed by the owner is to continue that use. It just happens to be a different person who's doing it over that time, and that would not be considered discontinued. So a little bit of a convoluted answer there, but when we're looking at that lack of continuity, we're really looking at not just how is it actively being used, but also what are people trying to do. Maybe they're doing a remodeling project, even though someone's not actively being in the office at the moment. They're showing their intent to continue to use that office. Hope that's helpful.
Next question. Did fees get updated with these changes? If no, then is that coming next? If yes, then by how much?
The city is going to be doing a fee study in the upcoming year, and so that will determine what the application fees are. I don't have a schedule for that yet, other than it will be happening coming up in 2026. And I don't know what the fee amounts will turn out to be. That's the purpose of doing the study. It won't necessarily move only by a fixed percentage.
How will master site plans, MSP, be reviewed if approved under the previous version of the UDC after the new UDC is effective?
If you have a master site plan that was reviewed or any other form of development that was reviewed and approved previously, then you can continue to carry that forward. We will deal with it as a non-conforming situation if we need to, but I think the majority of circumstances, there's not going to be too many where there's a conflict, I don't think. So we do have that opportunity. It's similar to if you platted a property and it had a lot size that was different for some reason than what the current code allows, you're still allowed to use that piece of property for development. And then we just work with the necessary adjustments to make it work.
Next question. Is it too late to submit and fix UDC typos? What is the process to submit?
Okay. If you have found a spelling error or something like that, you're welcome to shoot me an email, csaunders@bozeman.net. We do have a process where we can correct errors like that pretty easily, working with our codifiers. If it's something that is more significant, then we'll look at it and determine if we need to do a formal code amendment to correct it, or if it's something that is within the city attorney's authority to adjust as our code commissioner. So hopefully we can fix all those as quick as we can.
Is there a way to quickly determine all deviations being requested in a given site plan and their approval/denial status?
Well, a couple of things here. One, a deviation should be specifically called out by the applicant as part of their information that they've submitted. So if someone knows they're asking for a deviation, that should be front and center in the materials. So yes, if you look at the materials, that should be readily available. Sometimes during the review process, a nonconformity is identified and folks ask for a deviation to resolve that. That would be a change to the application, and so it would have to be called out. Deviations do require specific public notice for their review, new code and old, and so those would be called out in that method and be able to be seen and identified during any public or private review for the application.
When pedestrian right-of-ways are used to break down a block, do they have to be open to the sky, or can a building be located over top of it?
Open to the sky is the standard. It's a right-of-way. We don't put bridges over Main Street. Some other places do. But for us, a right-of-way is clear.
Briefly, what are the changes from the present to the new regulations for ADUs?
Not much. The city already had put into place quite a few adjustments over the last few years, and we made some revisions also based on some state directives. So that pretty much made the changes we thought might be needed. So I don't believe there's, from the Chapter 38 side of things, I don't think there's material adjustments to ADUs.
Okay, this next question, there's an acronym that I don't know what it stands for, so I'll just read it out.
Okay.
Can you provide an update on CILWR? I have heard the dollar amount may be increasing. Are there any other changes being contemplated?
Okay, good question. The CILWR stands for Cash in Lieu of Water Rights. That's managed by our engineering folks. And so they would be the folks who would be able to answer that question on potential changes or other adjustments to the price or other limitations. So there was a little bit of modification in the UDC in Chapter 38, Division 410, I believe it's Section 120, that clarified some language relating to those, but it didn't change the figures. So if you want costs on the figures, that would be something I have to refer you to engineering for.
Next question. Is there an updated checklist specifically for master site plans or just site plans?
Okay. We are working on updating all the checklists, as Audrey mentioned. A master site plan does not, to the best of my knowledge, have a separate checklist.
All right, and the last question, who is a codifier?
Good question. So the city's municipal code is roughly 1,000 pages long. in total. And when the city amends it through an ordinance, the ordinance only touches a very small portion of that 1,000 pages. So the codifier is the person who takes all of the text from the edits that happened in the ordinances and inserts it properly, taking out language, adding language, rearranging language as needed, so that there is a single set of information that is the Bozeman Municipal Code. It's why we call it a code rather than just an ordinance. The code is all of the ordinances collectively. Let's see here, just one second. I'm actually going to share my screen again to help answer this question. So this is, you can see at the top corner it says MuniCode codification. MuniCode is the company. Bozeman is us, obviously. And here is the list. So starting with the city charter in part 1 and then going down to the chapters. And there are 42 chapters in the municipal code. You can see over here on the right-hand side, ordinances not yet codified. If we, let's see here, let's just grab the first one. If we open up the ordinance, you can see that there is language where it's been edited. Underlining has been showing that it's adding in some new words. The codifier will go through the municipal code. They will insert everything that's shown as an underline. They'll remove anything that's shown as a strikeout, and they'll adjust placements if appropriate. And so it can be quite a long process. But in this case, the codifiers that we work with is MuniCode, and then they help us serve this out to the public through the web.
So there are no more questions.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for who has attended. We'll stick around for a few more minutes if somebody has a question that pops to mind. We'll also be doing some future presentations on other elements of the code, diving in a little more, as I said, to some more detail. But we wanted to give you a good introduction to start with. And so keep an eye out for the announcements for those future opportunities. Thank you for attending.
One more question. You may have said this. When does the new UDC go into effect?
It takes effect on February 1st, 2026.
And then we have a question about where can we find this recording? I will put this up on the Engage Bozeman site. Did you say that it would also be on the ComDev website too?
We should probably keep it just on the Engage Bozeman. That's probably the better place. It's just one location.
Okay. Yeah, so Engage Bozeman. Where do we find out when the next or how do we find out about the next Zoom session? That will just be through our normal modes of communication, through Engage, through social media, through news item on our City of Bozeman website. The next one isn't planned yet.
Now, the Engage Bozeman has a spot where we put project updates. So there's one there that's announcing the meeting today, and we will put another one up there for the future as we go along. So that's probably the best place to go there. And the URL for Engage Bozeman is engage.bozeman.net/UDC will take you directly to this particular project.
Oh yeah, and then we have a question about putting up the text for the recording. Yes, I can include text when I link the video. Transcript, I think that's what you're talking about.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate your time and hope you're finding this helpful. If there's particular topics that you think would be helpful, please let us know. We're happy to try and address what folks are most concerned about.
One more question popped up.
Sure.
From your perspective, what is the biggest hurdle for future development applications in relation to code changes and receiving completeness?
Good question. Bozeman asks for a lot of information. We regulate a lot of things in the interest of community concerns. And so it takes a lot of work to submit a complete application. Sometimes folks get in a bit of a rush and they submit an application before it's fully ready to go. So probably the biggest challenge is just making sure that they've been very careful, included all of the necessary information, and that we can find it. Sometimes folks are better than others at having a well-organized application set, and sometimes things are just tricky to find. Okay, last call for questions, and then we'll button up.
If we have further questions, are the review coordinators best reached through email or phone?
Audrey, can you take that one, please?
Either, whatever your preferences for communicating, we're available either way.
Okay.
Great.
I think that we're going to button up for the day then. Thank you all for attending and have a lovely afternoon.